when we have guests come over. It's like, why do you try something new today? Why wouldn't we try this last week and see if it's good before we have the guests come over, and then we try it then? It always works out though. But this morning I've got a video that is an MAF video, so I do have some pictures. And it's part of our 75th anniversary celebration, which we obviously didn't have this year. We did it virtual. So we had people from all over the world attended it via Zoom, as many of you might have done with work or whatever else. But this is a kind of a historical scenario of one of our bases in Indonesia, and kind of the life of the arrival in that village and what it's done over the years. So let's see if this works. Here we go. That's kind of the circle of, it's meant to be a full circle from somebody who sent something to a missionary or prayed for a missionary in 53. The missionary gave to the villager in 62, and the villager subsequently gave it on to somebody else 60 years later. It just paints a picture of the story of the cycle that is meant for those that go, those that send, those that pray, those that do, and ultimately those that receive. So anyway, the verse there, that I'm not sure when that verse is there. Let's see. There it is. Always offering prayer with joy in my every prayer for you all. In something. I chose this background not knowing what it was going to look like. So and of your anticipation in the gospel from the first day until now. But anyway, that was what the verse, and it means it really is the partnership. It really is the cycle. We get to live out vicariously some of the things, or you live vicariously out through some of us that go. We couldn't go without those that sin. And so the video in the 75th is really a Thanksgiving. And so that's why I chose my theme of today, thus the leaves and the fall and Thanksgiving. So if you want to, you can turn in your Bibles to Psalm 100. That's where we're going to spend the better part of this time this morning. This last week we spent a half day of prayer on Wednesday, where we do it all over the world with the MAFs, and we also got to watch videos of many of the programs and the people that are writing back here to say thanks again for all of the things, and then all of the stories that we heard. And so it just reminded me of it would be a great time to talk about Thanksgiving, and some of the things that we are called to do, but not only called to do, but privileged to do. I will tell you, if you don't remember my history of figuring out anything about coming to Lowman, it's really Wade's fault. Wade and Ted, they stole a bunch of maple trees from my front yard. Came out one day, they were gone. Found out that they... That's right. That's right. I called a number of people that wouldn't return my calls, but one of them didn't return my calls. It actually wound up being Ted. But he had put me on to Wade, and then Shelley came to town and did some measuring, and lo and behold, they started taking maple trees until they were all gone. No, they were actually dying. So it was, we did need to, but that's how I found out about it. He came back after the first load, and he said, hey, you ever go do stuff on Sundays? Like, you get some time off? I said, well, yeah, for what? He said, well, sometimes we might need a pastor or a preacher to come up to our church in Lowman. Anyway, so that was my connection to Lowman. It was really the first time that we'd ever driven past the Banks turnoff there. So it was last year, even though we've lived here for 3 years. We don't get out much. We were always afraid of driving in Africa. That's why we flew. We don't have an airplane here, so we didn't want to go anywhere. But nonetheless. So Psalm 100, I'm going to read many of the passages from the screen, provided I can read them, unlike the first one. But shout joyfully to the Lord, all the earth. Worship the Lord with gladness. Come before him with joyful singing. Know that the Lord himself is God. It is he who has made us, and not we ourselves. We are his people, and and the sheep of his pasture. I should know that because I'm preaching on it. Enter his gates with thanksgiving and his courts with praise. Give thanks to him. Bless his name. For the Lord is good. His loving kindness is everlasting, and his faithfulness to all generations. It's an amazing passage. One that, as I was studying, I was reminiscing of many songs that I grew up singing. When we transitioned from more hymns to more choruses, many of them were written directly out of Psalms. I remember singing many. So there's some of them I'm going to make reference to as we go through this, just because they came with new memories or refreshed memories as we got to them. But in the first couple of verses here, there's really three commands. There's shout, worship, and come. And the first one there in verse 1, shout joyfully to the Lord. The ESV translation is one that I commonly have heard referred to as make a joyful noise to the Lord. What do you think of when you think of joyful noise? Singing. Praises. Praying.
Laughter.
Yeah. Clapping. You know, for some, it's actually just the quietness of the snow falling from the branches as they get loaded down with snow. It's sometimes that quietness that is a joyful noise. Wade said something last time we were here that I've never forgotten. The singer, I think, didn't show up that day or whatever. And he said something about the rocks crying out and mentioned the fact that the chips in that computer up there were made from rocks. And technology, and how that had been, we were able to use that even in the midst of that. Never forgot that. For me, it was a guy named Tim Rasnick. Tanya would remember Tim, and a joyful noise. We would sometimes stand in front of Tim. He was a deacon in our little church in Watauga, Tennessee, where I was studying to do my pilot training with Moody. We did 2 years in Chicago, and then we did 4 years in Tennessee, where they did all the aviation stuff. And in our little Baptist church there, it was a stereotypical red brick up half the way, white siding, steeple out front. It was Tennessee, so the deacons would smoke between the service out front. No, just kidding. They did, but nonetheless, that wasn't in the notes. I should stick to the notes, sorry. Anyway, Tim was a guy who couldn't sing at all on tune. But Tim was a guy that loved the Lord. I get emotional thinking about him. Because sometimes if you didn't know Tim and you were standing over there, you'd be like, man, where is that coming from? What is that guy doing over there? But the more you got to know Tim, the more you knew that the songs that meant to him, he would sing even louder. And it got even worse. Worse in the sense of what it might have sounded like to us. But I think of the joyful noise that it must have sounded like to the Lord. And always think of that when I hear that verse, make a joyful noise, because he did. They speak of praise and the ring of excitement. And to Tim, that's really what it meant. The Hebrew word here is the same one that Joshua used when they marched around the city of Jericho. And then at the end, on the seventh time, he said, now shout. And the ruha is the Hebrew word. And they shouted at that level, that noise at that time, and the walls came down. Can you think of a time where you have made a joyful noise, and even in a shouting manner, even if it's not necessarily in the context of church, but in the context of excitement and something that got you motivated? Thinking of I often think of sports games where you're on one side and you're in competition with the other side, or at youth camp sometimes we did that to where it was the loudest one was going to win, and they even had a sound meter sometimes, so they would check you and see if you were making that loud noise. But the one commentator here that mentioned the story about the Jericho, he really wanted to paint the picture that this was something that the people believed in, and the shouting and the joyful noise came out of their heart. It came out of their trust and their belief that when they shouted or they made that noise, that it actually meant something to their king. For me, I think of the joyful noise was often when in Chicago we went to Moody Church, which was down the street from Moody Bible Institute where I studied. And this gargantuan structure that was built way, way long time ago. And there'd be 3,000 or more people in this brick structure with this giant pipe organ and singing something like, "And Can It Be?" or "A Mighty Fortress Is Our God," and everybody's in harmony, and just the sound that it made, that's to me was the joyful noise that comes to my mind. I didn't often grow up singing harmony in church, even though I was in choir, but it was later on when I went to Bible school where I thought, those other chords, those are the ones that bring the music to life. And so being in a loud church like that where they're singing in harmony and pulling the parts out, it means an amazing part of making a joyful noise. Verse 2, here it says, worship or serve the Lord with gladness. These verses signify they speak to the personal nature of God. He wants us to do that. He longs for us to do these things in our day-to-day life and to do them with Him. He wants this to not be just any worship, but one of joyful adoration and excitement for what He has done. And then he goes on to say, come before Him with joyful singing, or come into His presence with singing. I'm reminded often of the village church in Congo, the first place we lived. And they were big on choirs. The second country, Lesotho, still an African nation, but I'm not really sure that tribe, the Basutu tribe, they didn't get the singing gene like the Congo villages did. And they would live it up in Congo. They would come in and they would have the director, and he would be wearing this is in the bush. So, we're talking an hour and a half by airplane, 4 days by car, 11 days by boat. No electricity. We were the only pale faces in the village kind of thing. But there was a Baptist hospital there that we supported. So, there were 4 other pale-faced families, mission families there. But, they were totally black Africans, and the director would wear the white gloves, and they would come in, and sometimes they would have a generator running and playing the distorted loud over loud guitar. But when they didn't, and they would march into the service, and they would be singing in complete harmony, and often dancing, and have their hands and their motions, and that to me was just signifies coming into His presence with thanksgiving in your heart, and as we get to later. But the village churches were always something that brought this to life for us. We didn't understand the village language. They spoke in a village language called Kituba. We had studied French. So sometimes the pastor would speak in French, but not usually. It was Kituba. So we had young kids there. So when we first got there, Lauren, our oldest, was 2, and Lydia was 6 months. And then Natalie, the one on the end over there, she was born in Congo. She doesn't look like an African-American, but she is. And then Carson, he was born, believe it or not, in South Africa, where Morris is from. So we have 2 bona fide African-Americans in our family. Or so we say. But what any other things that come to mind when you think of coming into His presence, or coming into His presence with singing? Does anybody have a story or just something that they just pops into their mind? Yeah.
Yeah, we took a trip a few years ago to the Bahamas, and we went to church, and we were the only fellow facing there. And it was quite an experience.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. It's amazing how I've been in some that are. I was in a Chicago church that was a bit uncomfortable. It didn't seem like it was genuine. Not saying that it wasn't. It just was one of those things that didn't feel comfortable. And yet, in the village church, in that context, we felt like it had full meaning. That it was actually a part of their life. He had changed their life in that sense, and they were coming into His presence. But yeah, some of the verses that speak to this, if I can read them, I might stay to my paper because I can see it better than that one. Maybe you guys. I got glasses last year, but I really haven't worn them much. I'll be reminded of that on the way home, I'm sure. But Philippians 4:4, rejoice in the Lord always. Again, I say rejoice. That's one that reminded me of song. Did you guys ever sing that? Rejoice in the Lord always, and again I say rejoice. Anyway, that was one that right away popped into the head. I remember that we often did those on Sunday night. That's how we transitioned into choruses, and later became a mix, a hybrid service. Yeah. The next one, Psalm 107 there. He says, let them thank the Lord for His steadfast love, for His wondrous works to the children of man. And let them offer sacrifices of thanksgiving and tell of His deeds and songs and joys. And then Psalm 66, all the earth worships You and sings praises to You. Sing praises to Your name. This is the one where I was about the story with Wade talking about the rocks crying out. Last weekend we were at the Castle Rock State Park, or the City of Rocks, over in that area, past Albion. I didn't remember Albion was a place that was really busy last week, but we were driving by it going, well, there's a lot of people in the middle of nowhere here. Not to mention the red and blue lights that wound up behind me. But I thought it was Halloween prank or something, but I was apparently driving a little too fast. That's confession of the soul. It's always good.
Tell your children that when they're already.
Yeah, my wife is driving actually. No, but anyway, the Saturday morning we got up, me and a friend that we went with, and we went as two couples over there, and we hiked out in the dark up to one of the rock outcroppings, and we sat there waiting for the sun to come up. I think of the coming to His presence, and just even how in that verse 66 it says, all earth worships You and sings praises to You, sings praises to Your name. And even when we don't as people, the rocks cry out. And I envisioned the nature shows, or Moody did these videos for education sometimes, and one of them was the life that comes together when the sun comes up. And it's in a fast play motion, so you see the darkness and the sun's coming, and then everything stands up and everything opens up and the bugs start to fly and the critters start to move and the animals move and all of that, they just sing the praises of the Creator all day long. And then they go to bed and they do it again the next day. And maybe it's because they don't have emotion and they don't get sidetracked by what we do as humans and lose sight of the fact that our Creator still loves us. And even in the midst of this nonsense chaos that's going on in our country and around the world, we still have a chance to sing His praises and come into His presence with that singing. The Hebrew people talked about how they knew God. In verse 3, it says, "Know the Lord, He is God. It is He who made us, and we are His. We are His people and the sheep of His pasture." The Hebrew people knew God in that sense, Yahweh. They respected Him as King, but then they also had a deep level of knowledge of Him, to the point that in some cases they feared Him. But the name Yahweh meant something then. I think we've distorted the word of the Lord and even His name. And it doesn't mean what it did. That's why maybe it actually does, and that's why they're still trying to take it out of so many places, because it does have a meaning. And they want that uncomfortableness to go away. And hopefully if they take it out of our schools and take it out of our pledge and take it off of our finance or our money, that they won't be as guilt feeling as perhaps they are now. But His name means something. And the Hebrew people knew that. The idea was that the community, the group of people, they know God is evident, and in some cases because they just showed it. I've already talked about the villages in Africa, but the other village that comes to mind when I think of a village that didn't know God, but then subsequently became knowledgeable of God, is the one that back in the 50s in Ecuador, when the Auca or the Guarani Indians took out those 5 missionaries. One of them was an MAF pilot, Nate Saint, and Jim Elliott was amongst the ones. You've probably heard of Elizabeth Elliott. But when they were killed trying to take the gospel to this village, subsequently the wives of these missionaries went back into that village because they believed that those villagers needed to know who God was, and they needed to hear about His stories and about what He had done for them. They eventually, the whole village, it's talked about, the whole village gave their heart to the Lord. And those same men who speared these missionaries become elders and become on fire for Him. And so I think of them when I hear of someone who now knows God, because they went from not knowing God to full knowledge of Him and His forgiveness and what He had done for them. And it meant something to them. We saw in the video where the scriptures were brought in on the airplane. That's often something that happens in some of the places that we fly. And as a result, you see people that start to learn about God in their own language, as they call it, in their own heart language. And it starts to mean something to them. Anyway, Charles Spurgeon, he said, do you think it's possible for you to know yourself if you don't know God? He went on to say, it's very questionable whether a man can know himself until he actually knows his God. I think it's very clear in that. And that we really don't know ourselves until we understand who God is. And then we understand far more about ourselves. And helps us know where our place is. He went on to say in this one commentary that I was studying, Jehovah is God in the fullest, most absolute and most exclusive sense. He is God alone. To know Him in that character and prove our knowledge by obedience, trust, submission, zeal, and love is an attainment which only grace can bestow. Through the grace of God, we know Him. It means to know God is to love God. And through loving Him, we better understand His grace and what He wants to do for us because of that relationship. I do believe that I miss out often. It's always hard. I don't know, Morris, what you do and those of you that have ever had to get up in front of somebody and speak. My kids are probably hearing stuff going, yeah, Dad, you need to be listening to this stuff. I do believe that I miss out too often on what God has to offer because I do not take enough time to know Him. reading his word, meditating on it, spending quiet time reflecting on his goodness, and serving others, sacrificing myself to do something for others or to listen to him. Often things that I don't do enough of. But I believe it's often difficult for us to understand some of the metaphors in the Bible. As I was reading this passage, reminded often of Bible translators and how they have to work on some of these metaphors. They don't talk about sheep in Indonesia. They actually use pigs as references there, because sheep isn't something that's, I guess, part of some of those cultures. But the pig is. And so it really is, to wrap our head around it. But the metaphor of the sheep, and the fact that the shepherd knows his sheep and the sheep know the shepherd, is something that's actually quite amazing to watch. In Lesotho, the herd boys were these little kids that would go run the herds of sheep out into the mountains. I mean, they would be 8, 10 years old and have a flock of sheep out there on the side of the mountain. Cold as all get out. Snow, and they're wearing gum boots and a wool blanket is what they've got for their attire. But they're out there taking care of the sheep on the side of the mountain. But the sheep understand their voice. And know that they're there to protect them. There's, like every one of us, the dumb sheep that tries to get out of the pen or goes off, and we heard parables about that in the New Testament. But this metaphor of the sheep is pretty clear, that the shepherd knows the sheep, and the sheep know the shepherd. And there's definite roles to be played. David, the psalmist, is also saying that if we spend that much time with our shepherd, then we should know him and know that he is God. We will know that he has made us and that we are his people and the sheep of his pasture. Do we spend enough time with our shepherd to know his voice? I'm guilty of not doing that. And wonder if I hear it sometimes or why I don't hear it. It may be because I'm just not spending enough time with him. One commentator pointed out that David also brought up the idea of the king and his subjects. The kings were referred to often as shepherds of the kingdom and of the people. And he believed that the people were his, so he protected them. He counted on them. But the difference between the king and our shepherd is that king, we just became his subjects if we were under his rule. The difference between him and God is God actually made us. And so he has a much more intimate knowledge of who we are and what we do. Do you sometimes wonder why he chose you? I do. We've lived in some rough places and some pretty godless nations that I've traveled to, and wonder, how did I get chosen to come to know him? And why aren't others more knowledgeable of that, or do they not have a chance? We'll probably never know that, and I don't know that it'll matter in the end, because God is sovereign and he is on the throne. Those are things that we have to really understand and lean on right now as we're observing what's going on in our world. But definitely, why am I one of the sheep is a question that I've asked for years. And the more I see places and the more I travel and the more that we're a part of in missions, the more that becomes a deeper question, but one of gratitude and thankfulness that I am chosen by him to be a part of his flock. In another commentator, the Zondervan commentator, brought up the point that in the first half of the book of Psalms of 100, there were 3 commands. We've talked about those: the shout or make a joyful noise, serve and worship, and then come into his presence. The last half of the Psalms also has 3 commands, believe it or not. See, pastors, I guess I'm trying to do this 3 and 3, but there's usually, if you have 3 and more than 3, it's got to go 7 because of how it all works in Scripture. But so we're just going with 3 and 3. But the last half, the 3 commands are: enter his gates, give thanks, and praise or bless his name. They're all hinged on what he calls the structure and theological art of Psalm 100, which is right in the center, to know that the Lord, he is God. All of those hinge around that theological center. Some of the verses that are also tied to this one around the Bible are there in Psalm 95. Oh, come, let us worship and bow down. Let us kneel before the Lord our Maker, for he is our God. and we are the people of his pasture and the sheep of his hand. John 17:3, kind of the theme of John. And this is eternal life, that they know you, the only true God, and Jesus Christ, whom you have sent. And there in 1 Corinthians, or do you not know that your body is a temple of the Holy Spirit within you, whom you have from God? You are not your own, for you were bought with a price. So glorify God in your body. Verse 4, where it talks about enter his gates with thanksgiving and his courts with praise. Again, another song. Sorry, that anybody remember that? Can you start? With thanksgiving in my heart, I will enter his courts with praise. Yep, see, it's amazing how you can just start that, and before you know it, I think that is some of the things that making a joyful noise. That when you hear something, and then all of a sudden it becomes something you're humming throughout the day. I think that's pleasing. It's got to be pleasing to God to hear those things be part of who we are and part of our heart, that they come out even when you don't even think it, or somebody's like, you're humming, you're annoying me, and you're like, oh, yeah, sorry, that was Amazing Grace, I was just humming there, sorry. Anyway, verse 4 there, how many more pages do I got here, sorry. Oh, it's gone. We're on the downhill stretch now. Snow's melting. We'll be good to go. We should be able to beat the Methodists to the restaurant. Oh, that's right. There's no Methodist up there. So that's why we get out early in town. No, I grew up Baptist, so we did a lot with the Methodist church that was right beside us, and so that was always the running joke. We have to beat the Methodists to the restaurants, and then we get together at Thanksgiving, and it was always fun. But anyway, so, and I don't know why we picked on the Methodists. I think it's because that was our neighbor. Anyway, I have a lot of illustrations about Africa. In verse 4, we're entering his gates with thanksgiving. A large portion of our life, really was shaped by our time in Africa. We were 2.5 years in Congo, then we were 5+ years in Lesotho, and then spent 4 years in Kenya and South Sudan. And so all total about 12.5 years in Africa. So it's shaped a lot of what we do and a lot of how we think and even how our kids think and some of the things they get upset with and that other kids may not. Or we tried to explain to the teachers when we returned in 2014 that you may make an illustration about food or something like that, and they're not really going to get it. We stopped at a Sonic one time in Abilene, and I said to the kids, "You guys, anybody want a corn dog?" To which I got, "What's a corn dog, Dad?" "Oh yeah, I forgot." You probably haven't had one of those. Anyway, many of the memories were also about these African choirs that we saw, especially in Congo. And I also heard quite a few up in South Sudan, which is also a more isolated or remote part of Africa. I constantly think of the sounds that they made and the harmony that they had, and how it was just part of entering his gates with thanksgiving. It just sounded it. Anyway, was also the other day in our service in our church we go to a church in Eagle down in the valley there, and we talked a lot about it. The pastor was talking a lot about recently about the temple and the sanctity of the temple and who could enter and who couldn't. I can only imagine those that finally got access to the temple, what it meant to them to enter his gates or enter the gates, and even to go in. As a non-temple observer or someone who was not privileged to have that, but as the gospel became open to the Gentiles and to be able to be a part of that, that's a big thing with even some of the places where you saw the building being built in the video of over there, but to start to become a part of a church and a body of believers that's organic, that's grown like that, it's got to be pretty exciting, especially, like I said, in the New Testament times when the Gentiles finally got to enter those courts, even in the physical sense. They didn't have to, in the spiritual sense, have that barrier, but it finally became something that was open to them. What did I say here? They wanted to do what the psalmist was telling them to do. They finally had the chance to enter the temple. They could enter the courts and give thanks to him directly, as well as bless his name. That one commentary with Charles Spurgeon He said, this is how he put it. He said, so long as we are receivers of mercy, we must be givers of thanks. Mercy permits us to enter his gates. Let us praise that mercy. And so in that same way, these verses here kind of reiterate that. Psalm 103, he writes, bless the Lord, O my soul, and all that is within me. Bless his holy name. Bless the Lord, O my soul, and forget not all his benefits. Goes on in Psalm, a song of praise of David here. He says, I will extol you, my God and King. Bless your name forever and ever. Every day I will bless you and praise your name forever and ever. Then in the New Testament, we know this one. Through him, then let us continually offer up a sacrifice of praise to God. That is the fruit of lips that acknowledge his name. How are you doing on entering with praise, giving thanks, and blessing his name? It's been kind of hard the last few months, I'll be honest with you, on our side. Whether it's the crazy virus that's doing whatever and wherever, or the weirdness of the school that we've got going on where they're a day in and a day out and whatever it is. Then there's the whole election mess. There's just we might say a more and more of a godless world that we live in. And it seems harder to enter those gates. It doesn't have to be. They are there for us. And he wants to hear us follow those, shout and worship and bless, and to come. So, in the Psalm 100, David talks about the shouting like the Jericho shouting in the walls. It was the one commentator said that's almost like the raising of the roof. But here in this one, in verse 5, where he says, for the Lord is good, his steadfast love endures forever, and his faithfulness to all generations. He referred to this one as, the first one raised the roof, this one brought down the house. Yeah. Kind of closing it out. And that steadfast love is something that is throughout. I think of what that steadfast love means to somebody who may hear about it for the first time. And that brings me to the stories of Lesotho. Lesotho is a place that's in the mountains. They don't have any trees though, but they were mountains. So some of the hills coming up through the horseshoe bend there that don't have any trees on them. That reminds me of Lesotho and the mountains of Lesotho. Some of the craziest flying that we ever did, but some of the most remote and isolated peoples. 33% by the books, 33% of the population in Lesotho of 2.1 million has HIV/AIDS. Some of the places we flew, 5 to 6 out of every 10 persons has the disease. Talk about a place who needs to know and understand about God's steadfast love. I can remember wondering why there were only 1 or 2 missionaries in the mountains of Lesotho, and thinking, it'd be kind of hard to talk about God's plan and his wonderful plan for your life when 5 of your friends are dying from a disease. But what it is like when they finally understand that it is that steadfast love that gives them hope. Even though their life is in despair and their world is crumbling apart and they're losing their family members, that steadfast love is something that they need to cling to when they find out that there's hope in Christ. To many people, they have this distorted view that God is just a mean judge and that he doesn't care for them. The phrase steadfast love is mentioned 196 times in the Old Testament and 127 times in Psalms alone. Think he's trying to make a point? I do. Romans 15:8. If you can read that, sorry, I'll pick a different slide if I get invited back after this one. For I tell you that Christ became a servant to the circumcised to show God's truthfulness, in order to confirm the praises or the promises given to the patriarchs, and in order that the Gentiles might glorify God for his mercy. As it's written, therefore, I will praise you among the Gentiles and sing to your name. Nahum 1:7, the Lord is good, a stronghold in the day of trouble. He knows those who take refuge in him. And then here, this one is where I'm going to close with this verse and the points that come out of it. Oh, give thanks to the Lord, for he is good, for his steadfast love endures forever. Let Israel say, his steadfast love endures forever. Let the house of Aaron say, his steadfast love endures forever. Let those who fear the Lord say, his steadfast love endures forever. What does your household say? Can it? Does it say? Are you saying Are you a part of shouting to the Lord with worship and gladness and coming into his presence with singing? Can you enter, or are you entering his gates with thanksgiving and his courts with praise? Are you giving thanks to him and blessing his name? We're guilty of not doing it as much as we should. But yes, you can. If you know and understand that the Lord is God, he made us, we are his people and the sheep of his pasture. His mercies are new every morning because he is good and his love endures forever. And he's faithful to our generation just as he was to generations before us, and the same as we will be to that he will be to the generations that we are raising up right now. It doesn't matter what's going on in the political world. We've had that conversation with our 18-year-old who just voted for the first time this year, who is beside herself with what is going on in the election that she got for the first one. But my wife said it best, that God is still on the throne. He is still sovereign. And believe it or not, I read this week how Steve McQueen gave his heart to the Lord before he passed away of cancer. In MAF, we have two options when we fly airplanes. We fly missionaries, or those that are not, we try to make them missionaries. So right now, our job is to not support the believer in the White House. Our job is to pray that he comes to know the Lord while he's in the White House. Okay? Enter his gates this week, if you can. I know you can. Do it. And enjoy that. Listen to the snowfall. Hum the songs. But just serve the Lord with gladness this week. Thanks for giving us a chance to come up here. And anyway, there's some stuff back there with MAF, some calendars. We got them before.